Welcome to episode 8 of my Kawasaki S1 550 build, and in this episode I had to rummage around to find an old frame, but it needs a bit of work, so I sort out a few problems and then trial fit the engine to make sure it fits, and once it's all done I can get the frame over to my friend Neil's shop for painting in gloss black 2-pack enamel. I've got an old Kawasaki 250 frame up behind one of my sheds in the garden, so let's go and have a look. I think it's a bit rusty, but I'm sure it'll clean up. Initial impressions are that it is definitely a bit rusty, but it doesn't look too deep. The main thing is it looks quite straight, so let's get it out from behind the shed to have a proper look. The first thing I notice is that the oil tank mounting bracket is a little bit loose. In fact, it's broken off and it's just hanging on by a thread, but we can weld that. And also the front bracket's got a crack in it and it's been bent, but we can straighten that out and weld that as well. But the worst damage I can see is the brake pivot. It's been badly repaired in the past, so I'm going to have to cut that off and replace it with a new bar. Looking around the frame, I can see that the lock stop's not been damaged, which is a good sign. The main frame tubes seem to be nice and straight. All the brackets and lugs are there. The footrest mounting point's not bent. And the headstock looks clean. So really it's just these few little things I've got to repair. So I can use a pair of pliers initially to straighten this piece up level with the other surface there. Then use my wire brush to give it a good clean up prior to welding. I use a rotary wire brush in my drill. It's much quicker than a hand wire brush. After just a few minutes of cleaning with a rotary wire brush, the surface is bright and shiny, ready for welding. On the other side of the tube, I notice a bit of the original Kawasaki MIG wire still attached to the weld from 1976. It's been there all that time, so I bent that and pulled that off. And now I can clean up the other bracket ready for welding. With the bracket cleaned up shiny, I use my pliers to realign it into its correct position. Looking around the frame, I notice that the steering bearings are still in place, so I tap those out with an aluminium drift. They tap out really easily, and actually in quite good condition, but I'll be replacing those with new tapered roller bearings. I noticed that one of the brackets for the reflectors is bent, so I straightened that out with some pliers. That's quite an easy job. With the frame turned upside down, I noticed that the steel bushes have rusted into the mounting points with the exhaust bowl on. These need to be removed, so I heat the frame up gently with my blowtorch. This expands the metal very slightly and allows the rust join to break. Then I can tap them out with a hammer. With both steel bushes removed, the next thing I'm going to do is have a look at the brake pivot. This has a bad repair with an arc welder. It's even got the original slag from the welding process still there, which chips off. So I need to get rid of this pivot, repair the frame and weld on a new pivot. So the first thing I'm going to do is clean up the surface with my wire brush to see what I've actually got to work with, what can be kept and what needs to be removed. I need to smooth down all these welds on the outside of the frame. There shouldn't be any there at all. All the welding should be done from behind. As you can see here with the original welds, they're actually cracked. I'm using a 1mm slitting saw to cut through the weld, through the bar, very close to the frame but not quite touching it. Then I can grind it down with my flapper wheel to remove the excess weld and material, as you can see here. I'm using a 120 grit flapper wheel. These are really good because they remove the metal in a more controlled way than a grinding wheel. I chip away even more slag. This is really hard and crystalline, so it's nice to chip it away. And then I tap the frame straight. But when I look round, I can see a dove in the bird feeder. He's pecking up all the food. He loves it. And it's so nice to be outside in the spring. The flowers are all coming out and the wind's blowing. It's just so lovely. I continue with the flapper wheel, gently removing metal until the surface of the frame is nice and smooth. And here you can see the rear part of the pivot shaft is completely broken away from the frame. So now I use my 1mm slitting disc to cut it off. With the rear part of the shaft cut off, all that remains is the piece of shaft that's actually in the frame. So I use a pair of pliers and it pops straight out. So that's just perfect. You can see here that the bracket on the frame's got a few cracks, but I can weld those up when I weld in the new shaft. I lay all three parts of the shaft on the ground so I can measure the length to get a new piece of metal to make the new shaft. I noticed that one of the helmet lock tabs is bent down tight against the frame. It should look like this one, so I bend it up with a screwdriver. It's quite easy to do. I finished cleaning where I need to clean with the wire brush. Then I can carry the frame back into the garage to do the welding. As I walk down the garden, I notice through the kitchen window that Trace is cooking some more cakes. So I go into the kitchen to have a quick look, but first I put the frame in the garage. It's not a good idea to take that into the kitchen. I can tell from the ingredients that are out that she's making cherry cupcakes, my absolute favourite. She's already cut up the butter and put that in the mixer, and now she's adding the sugar. After quite a bit of mixing, she has to use like a flat stick to go around the outside of the bowl to get rid of any bits that have been missed and make them go back into the mix, and then she adds some eggs. Followed by a drop of almond essence and a bit of flour. She then whisks the whole lot up into a nice smooth paste and adds the cherries, but not just one or two, the whole tub, so that's just perfect. After a gentle whisk, the mixture's dropped into the cupcake cases, ready to go in the oven. They take about 20 minutes to cook, so I'm going to go back out in the garage and make a new pivot for my frame. I found this bit of bright steel bar. It's just a bit bigger in diameter and just a bit longer than what I need, so that's just perfect to machine up a new brake pivot bar. I take the bar over to my lathe and grip it in my 3-jaw chuck so I can skim the outside diameter down to the correct size. I check with my vernier caliper that I've machined it long enough. The old shaft has a reduced diameter in the centre. This is to pack with grease, so I need to replicate that on the new shaft. So I put the old shaft against the new shaft, make 2 marks with a black marker pen, and then I can use that to machine the gap. With the recess machined, the next thing I need to do is cut the circlip groove, so I push the bar back in the chuck as close to the chuck as possible to prevent chatter. I put on a drop of oil to help it cut. With the circlip groove finished, the next thing I need to do is remove it from the chuck, turn it round and saw off the excess length. I then mark the length of the new pivot shaft using the old pivot shaft as a gauge. Then go over to my vise and trim it down to length using my hacksaw. Well, that was easy. So now, back in the lathe to face it off to length. Well, there's the finished brake pedal pivot shaft, all ready to go back into the frame. But first, I put a piece of bar through the footrest mounting points to use as a gauge to line it up by eye. Then, I can insert the pivot point into the frame and make sure it's parallel with the other bar before welding. I use the old pivot bar as a gauge to set the length of the new pivot bar. So the pivot bar is now all set for welding, but it's 20 minutes since the cakes were put in the oven, so I go back in the kitchen and Trace is just getting them out, and they look absolutely amazing. And Charlie Weaver supervised the whole process, and he thinks they're great, so he had to mix himself a big drink to celebrate. As usual, I'm under strict instructions not to pinch one, but I do anyway, and take it back out in the garage with me. It'll cool down quicker in the garage. Well, that's my excuse anyway. So, back on the frame, I'm all ready for welding. I start with the 2 small brackets first, leaving the pivot bar to last. I have to be really careful because the brackets are really thin and the frame's quite thick, so I've got to make sure I put the heat into the frame so I don't melt the bracket. Well, that's the first bracket welded. Now I can do the second one. With the 2 brackets welded, I turn the frame over to weld the pivot point. I double check with the old pivot point first just to make sure nothing's moved. You can see the magnet there holding it in place. So now I can tack weld that secure. After the first tack weld, I have to remove the magnet, otherwise it'll get destroyed with the heat. With the welded repairs complete, I go back out in the garden and use my 120 grit flapper wheel to dress down the welds. Well, I'm really pleased with that. Once that's painted, you'll never know. And I'm really pleased with the new brake pedal pivot shaft. It certainly looks a lot better than the old one did. The next thing I need to do is see if the engine will fit in the frame. Because this is a modified engine, it's slightly wider than it should be, so the mounting points are displaced. But that's easy to remedy with some new spacers. So I carefully lift the engine into the frame and drop it down onto its mounting point. And with a 4-cylinder engine, the engine lugs drop down on the outside of the frame, nice and tight, rather than the inside of the frame. I can then use ordinary bolts to bolt it in place. With 2 temporary bolts on the front, I put a temporary bolt in the rear, making sure it goes right through the frame in the correct place. Then I can measure the gap with my vernier caliper, and this one's 8mm, so that's one spacer. And the second spacer is 49mm, so then I can make some aluminium spacers to fit perfectly. I don't normally do drawings, but because I was working in the garden and my lathe in the garage, I thought I'd jot down a few dimensions so I don't forget. Back in the garage, I found a piece of aluminium bar that's just the right size for the job, so I can put it in my lathe, skim the diameter, bore a 10mm hole at the centre and part the bits off the length to make 2 spacers. With the bar skimmed to diameter, I set my parting off blade so it's 49mm from the front edge to part off the first spacer. With the first spacer parted off, I readjust the tool to 8mm and part off the second spacer. Well, that's the thin spacer finished, so now I just need to drill a hole through the thick spacer and then we can go back out the garden and try them on the bike. Well, that's the second spacer finished, so now they should both fit on the 10mm bolt nicely, which they do, so let's go out and see if they fit on the bike. Well, the first spacer fits in just perfect. It's a nice sliding fit, and bolt goes through, and the second one drops in nicely as well. So that's a brilliant job. I'm really pleased with that. With the engine in the frame nicely, and the new spacers working perfect, I can now remove the engine and get the frame off to the paint shop, knowing that it'll fit perfectly when it comes back, all gloss shiny black. I'm really excited to get the engine back in the frame and start it up and hear it run again. So I thought I'd put a little clip of the previous video where we did the first startup at my friend Henry's house. It was so loud and the mesmerising sound is ringing in my ears even today.
Okay, let's have it.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Now the frame's all ready for painting, so I thought I'd go up into my shed and find all the other bits I need so I can get it all done at the same time. And I was lucky, I got everything I need. I found the speedo housing and the torque arm, the top and bottom yoke and the back light and the brake caliper and a swinging arm to go with the frame. So now I've got everything I need. And I also found the aluminium parts to take to the vapor blaster, so that'll speed things up. So hopefully I can get some progress pretty soon. And on the way back up the garden, the hedgehogs were having a right old kerfuffle. They were running everywhere, backwards and forwards, and one was pushing the other one backwards and forwards like a rugby scrum. Very strange.